Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Naomi Hausman and I serve as the Director of Institutional Advancement at Gratz College. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for the first in this year's series, Rabbi Admiral Aaron Landis Lecture Series. Tonight's lecture is Fighting for Religious Pluralism, World War I and American Judaism, and it will be delivered by Dr. Jessica Cooperman. You will learn more about her work and accomplishments when our president introduces her in a few moments. The Landis Lecture is made possible through the generosity of Bryna and Joshua Landis and the Landis family. Please join me in thanking the entire Landis family for their generosity and commitment to Gratz. The Landis Lecture Series is dedicated to exploring aspects of Jews in the military and Jewish military history through the work of distinguished scholars. The lecture is named in memory of Rabbi Admiral Aaron Landis, a Jewish admiral who led the clergy corps, and for nearly 40 years served as the rabbi of the Beth Shalom congregation in Elkins Park, our neighbor in this area, and for many years also helped to lead Gratz College as a member of our Board of Governors. Before we get started, a few important notes about tonight's program. There will be an opportunity to engage in question and answer in the latter portion of the program. So please share any questions or comments in the Q&A on your Zoom toolbar. And just know that only the moderators and presenters will see what you enter in the Q&A. Also, the program will be recorded and shared with all registrants and on our YouTube channel once we have it ready to go. So now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Rabbi Dr. Zev Elif, the president of Gratz College. He's the author and editor of 9 books and more than 50 scholarly articles, and comes to us most recently from Chicago, where he served as Chief Academic Officer of Hebrew Theological College and Vice Provost of Touro College, Illinois. Welcome, President Elif. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Naomi. And none of those books are better than Professor Cooperman's. This is really a thrilling opportunity. Normally, the Admiral Landis Lecture is a one-shot, is a one-off. We bring in one scholar to speak about an aspect of the military, and because of our increased capacity, of our ability to negotiate the digital age, the Landis family were very warm in receiving the suggestion that we expand the project to offer a 3-part series. And the tripartite model really allows us to offer scholarship and learning that redounds to Rabbi Landis's legacy. And I point out and I acknowledge Mrs. Sarah Landis, who is on our conversation and our lecture this evening. Each aspect from Jewish Welfare Board, for example, and religious pluralism in the early 20th century, which speaks to Rabbi Landis' leadership as a former chairman of the Jewish Welfare Board, to chaplaincy in the Holocaust, to conscription. All of those speak to just one aspect of an incredible American Jewish leader. The inaugural installment, though, I'm very, very pleased to introduce Professor Jessica Cooperman. She's an associate professor of religious studies and director of Jewish studies at Muhlenberg College, now in Pennsylvania. Her book, Making Judaism Safe for America, World War I and the Origins of Religious Pluralism, was published by New York University Press in 2018 and was a finalist for the Solvenier Book Prize, which is one of the most prestigious awards in Jessica's field, my field, in American Jewish history. She has been awarded fellowships at the Center for Jewish History and at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. On a personal note, Professor Cooperman is a colleague and a friend, someone who has mastery not just of American Jewish history and Jewish studies, but American culture and American religion, gender. Her work to date really does anchor itself in an interdisciplinary, easily received type of scholarship. I'm so pleased to welcome my friend, my colleague, Professor Cooperman.
Thank you so much for that very, very generous introduction. It's really a delight to be here. Thank you for the invitation. to Zev Elif, to Naomi Hausman, and thank you also to the Landis family. It really is an honor to be speaking as part of this series, particularly given my own research focus on the chaplaincy and on the Jewish Welfare Board. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you very much. Okay, let me see if I can organize all my various screens. Give me 1 second. Here, I'm going to share my screen. This one. Okay, and I hope you can all see that. So that's me. Feel free to email me at cooperman@muhlenberg.edu if you have any questions beyond today's talk. I'm happy to continue this conversation. As Zev mentioned, I teach at Muhlenberg College in the Religion Studies department, but I'm trained as a historian and I'm interested in the history of Jews in the United States and increasingly in the history of how religion functions and is understood in the United States. I'm particularly interested in thinking about sort of the intersections of religion and Judaism and the American state. And tonight I want to talk about how World War I actually came to reshape American ideas about religion and religious pluralism. So let me see if I can advance our slides. Okay. So it's worth thinking a little bit about what we mean about religious pluralism, right? You're probably all familiar with the idea of the disestablishment of religion in the United States, right? This idea of separating church and state. And we think about the US as being a place in which religious freedoms are really important. I think we think about that correctly as being very important. But religious freedom isn't quite the same as religious pluralism, right? The founding fathers had a pretty good grasp of the diversity of Protestant religious experiences and religious commitments, but they were a little bit limited in their ideas about religion beyond Protestantism. And in fact, there was a great deal of suspicion throughout American history in terms of what the impact of other religious traditions, particularly actually Catholicism, might be on the United States. And so it's really interesting and I think important for us to notice the ways that this changes over the course of American history and to think about why it changes, how it comes to change. By the mid-20th century, Americans had moved away from the idea that guided the founding fathers to think about religion and religious freedom as applying largely to different types of Protestantism. And instead, they started talking about the idea of the United States having a Judeo-Christian religious heritage, right? They embraced the idea of what we tend to call tri-faith religious pluralism, the idea that Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism were all in some ways not just legally protected, but essential to American society and supportive of American democracy. In 1955, the scholar Will Herberg wrote a very popular book called Protestant, Catholic, and Jew, in which he argued that these three faiths, right, make up the cultural backbone of American society. Herberg wrote, "Together, these three religious communities, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, are America. Together, they embrace almost the entire population of the country, and in the scheme of things defined by the American way of life, constitute the three faces of American religion." Now, today, we might want to question the sort of limitations of thinking about American religion as just being Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, right? But at the time that this was said, it represented a fairly radical change from earlier ideas about American religion. And so I want to spend some time thinking about how that change came about and then to situate World War I, which I'm going to argue is kind of a crucial moment in advancing that kind of change in American ideas about what American religion is and the place of both Judaism and Catholicism within it. Okay, so the first thing I think we have to think about in understanding this change is immigration. The mid to late 19th centuries are periods of mass immigration to the United States. And you can see from this little chart I have here that the countries of origin really shift fairly profoundly in this period of time, right? Whereas earlier in American history, earlier in the 19th century, we see the majority of immigrants coming to the United States from Northern and Western Europe. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the sort of center of gravity of immigration to the United States has shifted pretty profoundly to being from Southern and Eastern Europe. And this is going to mean, among a number of other things, that the religious identities of these immigrants coming to the United States is going to change as well. And then, as now, these changes in who immigrants are, what their identity is, what their religious affiliations and commitments are, is going to provoke a tremendous amount of anxiety in American society, right? Particularly about Catholics. And I have some images on that one too. Catholic immigrants were seen as bringing values to the United States that were antithetical to American values, that were in some ways threatening to American values. So we have an image here on the screen of, this is the US public schools, and I assume this is our brave schoolmaster here defending these cowering, desperate children against the crocodiles crawling out of the American River Ganges. But if we look closely at the crocodiles, we can see that they're actually, these vicious toothed mouths are actually bishop's miters, as these Catholic bishops crawl out of the river and threaten the stability of the American public school system, threaten the values that are being taught to children. We have this American, it says Roman Catholic, right, institution in the background threatening American society. And here's another image, right? There's this kind of religion and national identity are sort of blended together as potential threats to American society. So we have another image here of Lady Liberty stirring her melting pot of citizenship and equal rights. But Irish Catholics in particular were often considered unassimilable, people who simply could not melt into this American melting pot. And so we have our Irish Fenian revolutionary here who cannot be absorbed into the melting pot of American citizenship, according to these fears about what immigration and ethnic, national, religious diversity is going to bring to the country. Jews also were often targeted as unassimilable immigrants, people who brought with them traits that were unwelcome, threatening, and undesirable to American society. So we have Uncle Sam here sort of holding his nose, even though he laments that there's no law to keep out this impoverished immigrant who carries with him disease and poverty and Sabbath desecration and political anarchy, right? So Jews on the one hand were depicted as people bringing in antithetical values who couldn't be assimilated into American society because of their poverty, their lack of ability to succeed and support themselves in American society. But they were also sometimes depicted as people who were too good at succeeding in American society. So here we have another image of why Jews are perhaps a threat to American society. We have these hordes of impoverished immigrants escaping from persecution in Russia through this long column and arriving in New York, which they've crossed out and relabeled as New Jerusalem, but rapidly through perseverance and industry become very successful. So you might think, well, that's great. They're going to contribute to American society. But the cartoon depicts that also as being a threat to American society, because as they succeed, we can see that they've renamed all the stores on the street. So Jews dominate American society, right? As they push other Americans westward, they're sort of following fast on their heels, right? So I give us these images to think about what a profound change American society had to experience in order to begin to embrace this idea of a Judeo-Christian tradition in which Protestants, Catholics, and Jews were all equally included. Here's a little bit more thinking about the early 20th and late 19th century, right? The fear that Uncle Sam is going to be swallowed up by foreigners, and these two very particularly threatening types of foreigners, Irish Catholics on the one hand, and this representation of a Chinese immigrant on the other hand, right? That these foreign elements are going to come in and destroy American society. And these fears actually lead to immigration restriction, which we see put in place. We see agitation for it starting in the late 19th century. And then in the early 20th century, we see real legislative steps limiting immigration into the country of people who are deemed too foreign, that they bring with them ideas and commitments that are antithetical to American values. Chinese exclusion, the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed in 1882, and that's our first very significant piece of immigration restriction. But in 1917, the United States further restricts the entry of Asian immigrants to the United States, creating what was known as the Asiatic Barred Zone, which barred immigrants both from China and India and other parts of the South Asian countries. And that is followed in 1921 by the imposition of further immigration quotas that restrict the number of immigrants who can come in from particularly from those southern and eastern parts of Europe to down to 3% of what the total had been previous to these quotas being imposed. And in 1924, the government will further restrict immigration down to 2%, really trying to keep Jews and Catholics and Asian immigrants out of the country. But I want to make the argument that even as the United States is struggling with what immigration means, what mass immigration of Jews and Catholics and people who differ from that sort of a Protestant founding father image, like what that's going to mean, how that's going to affect the country, there is a simultaneous force that pushes the United States to rethink how it understands the impact of particularly Judaism and Catholicism on the US and on American society. Now, I want to make the argument that the event we have to consider as sort of countervailing or weighing against these fears about immigration is the reality of World War I. As the United States gets ready to enter World War I, to send troops to fight in World War I, we enter the war in April of 1917. The United States initiates the largest draft the country had ever seen. There are about 5 million men who serve in the World War I American military, and 72% of them are drafted. That's in comparison to the Civil War, where only 12% of Civil War soldiers were drafted, right? So this is a huge increase in the number of drafted soldiers who come in to the military and have to very quickly be ready to defend the country, right? And because of those late 19th and early 20th century waves of immigration, an unprecedented number of these men drafted into the military, whether they wanted to or not, are going to either be immigrants, they're going to be foreign born, or they're going to be the children of immigrants. And the country is going to have to, and in particular, the US military is going to have to figure out how to deal with not only the military need to prepare these soldiers to go fight, but with the reality that this is the most diverse military that the United States has ever seen. There were approximately 250,000 Jewish soldiers who served in the World War I American military. That's more than had ever served in the military before. And some people estimated that perhaps up to 30% of soldiers in the American military were going to be Catholic. And this presented both a challenge and an unforeseen opportunity for both the government and I'm going to argue for Jews and Catholics in the United States. So now, even before the war started, there were Americans who argued that the military should be used as a tool for Americanizing these immigrants, for teaching them how to be good citizens, for introducing them to American standards, the American way of life. Theodore Roosevelt was among the most outspoken voices advocating for the use of the military as a tool for improving and Americanizing all citizens, but particularly immigrant men, in making them into better American citizens and soldiers. And so when the draft is instituted, those voices that had been calling for the country to use military service as a tool for Americanization actually found an unexpected opportunity. One of those people was General John Pershing, who was the Supreme Military Commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. Pershing really saw, he was very much himself this kind of embodiment of American ideals about military manhood. And he saw military camps as a place where, and I'm quoting from him, a rigid program of instruction is carried out with daily traditional American enthusiasm, engaged in healthy exercises in open air with simple diet. Officers and men, like trained athletes, are ready for their task, forbidden the use of strong drink and protected by stringent regulations against sexual evils and supported by moral courage. American mothers may rest assured that their sons are a credit to them and the nation, and they may well look forward to the proud day where on the battlefield, these splendid men will shed new luster on American manhood. Right, so that's the commander of World War I military forces speaking, and he really believed that men could be trained in what he felt were the moral virtues of American citizenship. We hear him warning against alcohol. The American military was very concerned about men drinking and visiting prostitutes, right? He felt that military discipline could correct these, what he saw as social ills, and teach these men to be good American citizens. He was supported in this project by the Secretary of War, a man named Newton Baker. Baker did not have a background in the military when he became Secretary of War. He had actually been the mayor of Cleveland, but he was a progressive reformer who also really believed that the institutions and tools of government could and should be used to make citizens better, to teach people how to be better Americans, how to be more morally upright, how to embrace American standards of living. And so Baker very much supported Pershing in this idea that if the United States was going to war, if it was going to be drafting all of these young men into the military, it shouldn't waste this opportunity. It should use the war as an opportunity to teach these young men, particularly immigrants, how to be Americans. And so Baker ordered the creation of something called the Commission on Training Camp Activities, or the CTCA, which was going to oversee a program of what he called soldiers' welfare activities. And Baker said these were going to be, and again, I'm quoting, wholesome recreational, athletic, and educational activities intended to keep men away from temptation and to inculcate in them a sense of patriotism, national pride, and shared culture. He argued that activities like sports, entertainment, and sing-alongs would subordinate the personal purpose to the common purpose, where individual success of any one must be forgotten in the common good of all. Now, Baker hired, or commissioned, I guess, this man, Raymond Fosdick, to run the Commission on Training Camp Activities and to oversee all of these new programs, which were going to, here, I'll give you some more images, provide things like libraries in the camps, and here's sing-alongs, right? That would keep men away from temptation and instead teach them American values, inculcate in them this sense of American manhood. Now, Fosdick had come to this job. He had previously been working for an organization called the Rockefeller Foundation, which had crusaded against social ills, what people saw as social ills, particularly against the spread of venereal disease. And he was also the brother of a man named Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was one of the most prominent and influential Protestant theologians of the early 20th century. So Fosdick, like Baker, like Pershing, came to the job with a strong sort of personal moral foundation and strong ideas about how government and government institutions could and should be used to teach men moral values and to teach them how to be better American citizens. Now, he was given an impossible task, Fosdick, because there were nearly 5 million American men in the World War I military. He only got this job sort of as the draft is underway, right? And he had no staff, right? How is he suddenly going to create morally uplifting, educational, recreational, and spiritually uplifting programs for 5 million men? And so Fosdick makes a strategic decision to outsource this work, or at least the running of this work, to an agency that he felt, and that Baker agreed, and that Pershing agreed, and that President Wilson agreed would be the most qualified organization in the United States to do this kind of Americanization work. And so he commissions the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, to become the organization in charge of running these programs for soldiers of all kinds across the country and military bases across the country, and eventually with military units sent to Europe to fight. Now, it wasn't a crazy choice to select the YMCA to do this work. The YMCA had in fact been running programs to provide these kinds of welfare services to soldiers since the Civil War. And they were really excited to have the opportunity to continue to do this work with soldiers in World War I. They had a staff of men ready to go. They had programs in place that they were ready to implement. They had experience working with soldiers before, and they assured everybody that they were a non-sectarian organization because they were open and welcoming and willing to provide services for men of all kinds, regardless of their background or their personal commitments. And I think that to men like Newton Baker and General Pershing and Fosdick and to President Wilson, who all might be described as part of what historian of American religion William Hutchinson described as the Protestant establishment, right? I think to these men, the YMCA simply looked normal, right? That the advancement of a Protestant organization simply appeared to be the invisible ground on which American values rested. The scholars of American religion, Anne Pellegrini and Janet Jacobson, describe this as stealth Protestantism, that it seemed so obvious to them, to these people within the Protestant establishment, that this was the correct organization to provide these services to soldiers, that they almost didn't question whether or not there was any kind of sectarian bias involved in this choice, right? The YMCA said, we will serve all soldiers, that makes us non-sectarian, and the government accepted that definition of non-sectarianism. Jews and Catholics, however, did not accept that definition of non-sectarianism because they had long experience, particularly Catholics had long experience with another aspect of the YMCA. The YMCA was, in fact, an evangelizing Protestant organization founded very intentionally to protect young men from the sinful nature of urban life by offering them Christian fellowship and Bible study. It expressly barred the participation of Catholics from any of its administrative programs, although it did do constant sort of missionizing and outreach work to Catholics as well as to Jews. The president of the YMCA at the time, a man named John Mott, had presided over the 1910 World Missionary Conference and is remembered among his many other significant accomplishments for his book entitled The Evangelization of the World in This Generation, which was published by the Student Volunteer Movement for Foreign Missions in 1905. So while the YMCA was incredibly happy to have unfettered access to providing welfare, morally uplifting welfare services to nearly 5 million American servicemen, lots of Jews and Catholics and new immigrants among them, Jews and Catholics were not at all happy with this choice, right? And we have here, I put up on our slide, descriptions that the YMCA gave of its work. It described the fundamental objectives of its work as being said, what is the fundamental purpose of Army and Navy work as conducted by the Young Men's Christian Association? It may be said that the simple and yet comprehensive objective in Young Men's Christian Association service is the making of symmetrical and serviceable Christian character. The manual that it provided to its workers also outlined the basis on which they could judge the efficiency of their secretaries, of their workers in military camps, and argued that the final test of the YMCA secretary's efficiency is how largely he is able to lead men one by one through his personal influence, through Bible classes and meetings, as well as through the participation of the individual in service for others to accept and follow Jesus Christ. His crowning service for any man is to lead him to allegiance to Jesus Christ. So while the government argued that it was simply providing education in American values through this Commission on Training Camp Activities, through these welfare services provided to soldiers, Jews and Catholics immediately saw the bringing on the YMCA to be the provider of these services as not being simply American, right, but as being a clearly sectarian attempt to instill Protestantism in its soldiers, right? And in fact, young men writing from military camps and bases noted this right away. A young man named Adolf Schertzer, who was stationed at Camp Fremont near Palo Alto, California, explained, the YMCA, as stated by their General Secretary John Mott, is essentially and preeminently a Christian movement. The YMCA does not deny this, nor in their work do they forget this. In their statistics of the buildings, they register the number of Christian talks they have each day. Only today I was on a retreat with Y secretaries, and if some of our doubting friends were along, I feel they would have assured a change of mind. The hymns, the talks, everything was decidedly Christian. I'm not condemning them for it. It's their duty, and they're doing it. Now, the military clearly had no plan of broadening American definitions about religion in order to move closer to that tri-faith model in which they thought of Jews, Catholics, and Protestants as equal partners in this tri-faith religious pluralist model that became so popular in the US in the 1950s. But we have to remember the importance of mass immigration and of the draft. The government needed those immigrants to serve in the military. They needed those nearly 250,000 Jewish men to serve in the military, and they particularly needed that perhaps up to 30% of its fighting forces who were Catholic to serve. And they couldn't afford to have their parents at home riot or protest or resist or refuse to buy war bonds or refuse to support the war effort. They had to find a way both to keep those immigrant soldiers on board with the war effort, and they didn't want to miss out on the opportunity to teach those immigrants and American soldiers from across the country how to be better Americans. So Jewish and Catholic leaders, rather than arguing that Protestantism should be taken out of the American military program, actually made an interesting counter argument. They argued that if men needed the sort of religious services that the YMCA provided, right, then Jewish and Catholic men wouldn't be able to respond to the Protestant ministrations of the YMCA. And in fact, they needed their own religious guidance. If men needed religious guidance to be better Americans, they argued, then surely Jews and Catholics will need Judaism and Catholicism to be more present in the American military. Now, Fosdick and Baker originally said no. They felt that this would be divisive and contentious, and they didn't want to do it. But the Catholic community had quite a weapon in its hand, with 30% of American soldiers identifying as Catholics. They lobbied hard, and eventually the government folded and agreed first to admit one more organization into its soldiers' welfare program. And they decided to include a group called the Knights of Columbus, which is a Catholic fraternal organization. And the Knights of Columbus immediately geared up to provide Catholic soldiers with what they argued would be Catholic soldiers' welfare services, right? And they called on their secretaries within American military camps to make sure that the Catholic identity and activity is not submerged in the provision of welfare services, and stressed that if the YMCA is conducting an evangelical Protestant program, that it was essential that they conduct a Catholic program in order to be able to reach Catholic soldiers and to teach Catholic soldiers American values. And I want to really emphasize that it wasn't just the presence of Catholics, it was the presence of Catholicism that became important to them in the military. Now, once this, the Knights of Columbus successfully argued for a place for Catholicism within the American military programs, then it became very difficult to argue why not Jews as well, right? If the government's position had been that they were simply advancing American values, they weren't looking to create sectarian divisiveness, and they now had Protestants and they had Catholics, well, then Jews argued that surely Jewish men would need an equivalent organization to provide Jewish welfare services to soldiers in the American military. And the Jewish Welfare Board was established in 1917 in order to provide exactly those kinds of services to Jewish soldiers in the military. Cyrus Adler, who was one of the founders of the Jewish Welfare Board, explained it was resolved as a guiding principle to extend the service of the organization to soldiers and sailors without sectarian restriction. They, like the YMCA, would be open to soldiers of all faiths, but at the same time, to make adequate provision, especially for the needs of soldiers and sailors of Jewish faith, whose particular requirements could only be fulfilled by an understanding Jewish organization. And we have another JWB poster. The government and the military added these agencies, the Knights of Columbus and the Jewish Welfare Board, as a necessity, right? They wanted to be sure that Jews and Catholics answered the draft, that Jewish and Catholic civilians supported the war effort, right? And they were kind of forced into accepting them as part of this commission to provide these uplifting social, educational, spiritual services to soldiers. But once they did it, right, once they sort of gave Jews and Catholics a seat at the table, it really did change American institutional ideas about religion, right? And even if it wasn't given willingly, the government became, the military in particular, became a kind of unexpected partner in advancing ideas about tri-faith religious pluralism. One area where I think that's really important to think about is in the Jewish military chaplaincy, and the military chaplaincy more broadly. Now, in theory, Jews have been able to serve in the military chaplaincy since the Civil War. But in practice, there had been no mechanism to appoint rabbis to the chaplaincy. There was no organization that could screen or recommend them. There was no legislative means of appointing Jewish chaplains. Chaplains were always chosen in accordance with the majority religion of men in any given regiment. Jews were never going to be in the majority. So one of the things that the JWB does, the Jewish Welfare Board does, once it gets this seat at the table, is that it advocates for the passage of new legislation, making it more possible, more practically possible for rabbis to be commissioned as military chaplains, for rabbis to serve on a non-sectarian basis. So for the first time in American history, we see rabbis visiting the sick in hospitals, tending to the wounded, helping to provide these spiritual services to men of all faiths, really making Judaism a visible part of the structures of the American military, right? Even going so far as to create a new insignia for military chaplains. Up to World War I, the only insignia for a chaplain had been a cross. And the Jewish Welfare Board, again, Congress lobbies people in the military to create a new insignia for Jewish chaplains, again, making Judaism present and visible as part of the institutions of the American military. So the US military very unexpectedly becomes a promoter of images of interfaith cooperation and equality. And they do this both through things like these insignias. They do it through their advertising and fundraising campaigns, right? So this is from the United War Work campaign of 1918, right? And we can see, again, they may not have wanted Jews and Catholics present at the table, but once they gave them that job, right, they included all of these groups, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, side by side in their advertising material. We can see here, right, the insignias of these different organizations. There were not less overtly religious organizations that also became part of this project as well, the American Library Association and the War Camp Community Service, as well eventually as the Salvation Army. And we can see them here with their flags, right? The National Catholic War Service, which grew out of the Knights of Columbus's program, and the Jewish Welfare Board here, alongside the YMCA and the YWCA over here, right? Here, Elkin Vorsanger was one of the first Jewish chaplains to serve in the American military and in World War I. He became known as the Fighting Rabbi, and he wrote really powerfully when he got home. In France, there were no distinctions. A chaplain was a chaplain, not a Jewish chaplain or a Catholic chaplain or a Protestant chaplain. Each chaplain was responsible for the religion of every man. It didn't matter how a man prayed, but that he prayed. A Catholic chaplain organized Yom Kippur services for the Jewish men in a ruined cathedral on the battle line. The division had been called out on Yom Kippur Day, and I was endeavoring to organize services along the line wherever there was a group of Jewish men. At Cologne, the Catholic chaplain came to me and said, "I was afraid you wouldn't get here. So I got your men together and started them off with a prayer. We'd arranged to conduct the services ourselves in case you didn't come. I took up the services where he had left off, and after the traditional prayers were said, we gave them a brief soldierly talk, and the men filed out of the cathedral and went on with the business of fighting." Right? So we see in the imagery, in the symbols of the military chaplaincy, and in these descriptions, this idea that Judaism and Catholicism are no longer foreign faiths. They're integral to the structures of the military, and they're important components of the military's program to build better soldiers and better citizens. Okay, let me skip ahead to this one. Now, by the end of the war, this idea that Protestants, Catholics, and Jews were going to serve side by side became increasingly embraced. Even Raymond Fosdick, who had initially not wanted Jews and Catholics as part of this program, gave a talk describing, at the end of the war, describing the work that they had done through the Commission on Training Camp Activities. And he said, "I know that some of you here have had the privilege of going up in an airplane, and you know just exactly how the ground recedes as the machine rises and the details and unimportant things disappear. You know that as you get higher, the fundamental things become plain and the fences disappear. I can't help thinking that this has been the result of the work in connection with these three great organizations, the YMCA, the Jewish Welfare Board, and the Knights of Columbus. The fences have disappeared, the sectarian lines have vanished, and this work has been carried out not as Jewish work or Protestant work or Catholic work, but as American work carried on for all the troops in the camps without regard to faith. Now, these steps that were taken in terms of changing military policies and governmental attitudes towards the place of Jews and Catholics, and particularly of Judaism and Catholicism in American society, didn't change the country overnight. And in fact, students of American history know that the interwar period is actually a period of renewed fears about immigrants, anti-Semitism, and anti-Catholicism. But the changes that were made during World War I stayed in place, even as the country continued to wrestle with its anxieties about what new immigrants might mean, about the place of Judaism and Catholicism within American society. The military left these new institutions and new policies in place, such that by the start of World War II, it wasn't even a question, but that Protestants, Catholics, and Jews would serve side by side, and that Judaism and Catholicism were necessary components of the American military program to provide for the welfare of its soldiers. So I have here a very famous image embodying this idea of tri-faith religious pluralism. It was a stamp issued to commemorate the death of these 4 chaplains, 2 Protestant, 1 Catholic, and 1 Jewish, whose ship was torpedoed and who went down with the ship. It's actually a moving story of the war, but it's worth noting that the military and the government, again, not only take it for granted that Protestants, Catholics, and Jews are necessary, that they will all serve together, and that all 3 faiths are necessary to the welfare of the military, but they commemorate it in things like stamps. And it's worth noting as well that those 3 organizations, the YMCA, the Jewish Welfare Board, and the Knights of Columbus, go on to collectively form another organization that had tremendous influence in the military, the USO. And in fact, these 3 Protestant, Catholic, Jewish organizations become the institutions that found the sort of modern expressions of soldiers' welfare services in the military today. So I want to argue that for all of the anxieties that we see about immigration and the real struggles that American society has had in finding places for Catholics and Jews, the military kind of unexpectedly and unintentionally to a great extent became one of the driving forces in advancing the idea of tri-faith American pluralism. Thank you.
Wow. And I don't know for the, when I read the book and I read the scholarship, we have these conversations, Professor Cooperman, what strikes me is that in doing this work on YMCA, Knights of Columbus, Jewish Welfare Board, obviously, it not so much about discovering these agencies. There's a literature on them that far preceded our work, in your work on this in particular, but the narrative and the analysis and making sure that the field understands the origins of religious pluralism predate the post-World War II period. It's a field changer. It really, really is. You can't say that, but I can.
You're very generous. I appreciate it. You're very kind.
And so we're going to open it up to questions. We have some few minutes, so it's very good. First, a comment, this by Nancy Isserman. Thank you for noting this. It's that the Chapel of the 4 Chaplains is actually here in the Navy Yard in Philadelphia. Here, what does here mean? One that Robert Roth, he asks a question, and it's a good reminder about contingencies. You had alluded to this, is that the argument against the YMCA's involvement might have been, well, what about the Establishment Clause? What about separation of church and state? The decision to embrace religion, therefore religious pluralism, is one of the odd contingencies, a choice made by the historical actors. So here's this question of, was their movement, was their action the other direction during World War I?
To try to push religion out, to say, what about disestablishment?
Yeah, what about the Bill of Rights? Exactly right.
That's an interesting question. Okay, so I'm going to hedge my bets on it because I don't really know. But I'm going to assume yes, right, that there were plenty of other voices in the United States. There were, in particular, anti-war voices. There was a significant socialist voice in American politics that I'm going to guess actually wanted to see religion pushed out of these institutional spaces. But one of the things that I think makes World War I an important inflection point is that as part of fighting the war, the federal government expands its powers profoundly, and its ability to regulate and control the populace and to restrict public discourse. So while I am sure that there were voices fighting against this, not voices in positions of power. I think that one of the Jewish Welfare Board's sort of genius moves is recognizing where power lay and how they were going to be able to advance their project, which was largely about protecting Jewish soldiers from the evangelizing work of the YMCA. And I think they had evidence that fighting against that tide was not going to work, but that finding ways to swim with it might work. I think also the men who ran the Jewish Welfare Board were by and large wealthy, well-established figures who may have been largely sympathetic to some of the social concerns that their Protestant counterparts had, but wanted to find a way to be sure that they were translating that into a Jewish key, if you want, that they weren't exposing their young men to missionary work, even while they, to a large part, agreed that immigrants needed to be Americanized and socialized into American values.
Right. You mentioned the same elites. Of course, you had indicated that one of the founders was Cyrus Adler, who was simultaneously, let's see if I can get it right, president of Gratz College, Dropsy College, the Jewish Theological Seminary, the Jewish Publication Society, and I think his day job, he was the curator at the Smithsonian.
Yes. In his spare time, he was also the curator of the Smithsonian. It is interesting. I actually was just reading an excellent book by Jacqueline Granick on international humanitarian work during World War I and the work of the Joint Distribution Committee, which is also very worth reading. But it's the same cast of characters to a large extent who are controlling all of these Jewish organizations. And so there is sort of another story embedded in this about who are the power brokers in the American Jewish community at this time, and what did they want to get out of the war.
Yeah. So Gratz Chancellor Paul Finkelman, he raises the question of when did Muslims enter into a conversation about religious pluralism? I think it's quite later, but he does indicate that there is a migration. When are there such discussions?
It is going to be later. And I think there, again, it's going to be tied very much to immigration patterns. So it's only after World War II that we see much larger numbers of immigrants from Asia, from other parts of the world entering into the country. And as you have the numbers of military personnel from different religious communities start to grow, they too argue that they need religious representation in the country. So while there's a Muslim population in the country, obviously for much earlier than the second half of the 20th century, it's really in that later period of time that we start to see those voices get elevated. And even within the Protestant world, we start to see sort of like disaggregation of voices, right? Mormons actually or the Church of Latter-day Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right, is a really interesting story because they were sort of folded into the category Protestant for a very long time. And then they too said, no, we want our own kind of religious ministration within the military. We also need a sort of separate voice in the military and in the chaplaincy.
Right. So I'll ask my question. Actually, no. Let me continue on with some others. Well, let me ask mine, then we'll go into others. It's interesting is that the icon chosen was the Ten Commandments. And there's a film, not the Charlton Heston film in the 50s, but there's a 1920 223 film of the Ten Commandments. And it's interesting that that icon that was cultivated, not created, but that was proselytized, so to speak, through the Jewish Welfare Board and choosing the Ten Commandments rather than a Star of David or maybe another symbol, I think is quite interesting.
There was actually a debate, and some people on the Jewish Welfare Board had advocated for a Star of David. And I'm not sure whether it was within the Jewish Welfare Board or it actually came from the military, but there was concern that they would look too much like a general's star, and that this would be perhaps misleading or confusing or overstepping boundaries. And so after significant discussion back and forth, they landed on the Ten Commandments with a little star on top.
Interesting. Did you see any, as a question from Warren Stern, about promotion in terms of chaplains and rising through the ranks? That sure, Jews now had agency to, and Catholics, of course, to certain key chaplaincy positions, but were they still, was there any limitation in their growth, in their rank?
So there's no explicit limitation, right? There's no statement of limitation. There's no overt roadblocks put in place. There were, though, particularly for chaplains and for military officers, more subtle types of roadblocks. Men who were born in Germany or Austro-Hungarian territories were sometimes considered perhaps suspicious because they might have ties to the enemy. For chaplains, they were required to have ordination from an American institution. So Orthodox rabbis, for example, I don't think there were any Orthodox rabbis in the World War I military, probably not any in the World War II military chaplains corps, because of this requirement that they have both a college education and American ordination. So that became a sort of another limitation in terms of who could serve. Men with accents, who spoke with foreign accents, often were considered inappropriate for promotion. So there are these kind of more subtle roadblocks put in place. And you know, I'm sure there were more overt expressions of limitation as well.
So a question from, thank you, from Jason Levitz asks, and you had indicated about it, the swing toward nativism and anti-Semitism in the inter-warriors. We know about quotas, universities. I think some scholars count as many as 40 different colleges and universities had quotas limiting Jewish enrollment in other areas. What was in your view, did World War I stymie that for a bit? How did it, World War I and the military in particular, how did it impact the eventual rise in anti-Semitism and racism?
I think I would argue that the experience of World War I created this sort of underlying institutional basis through which religious pluralism became possible. It did not stop the tide of nativism, which was well underway, as we can see in the anti-immigration legislation in 1917 and 1921. Those nativist voices were strong and growing stronger. There were plenty of people who said World War I demonstrates the sort of dangers of multinational societies and the threat that they will be, the United States could be balkanized in the way that that Europe was, and that we have to fight against the presence of these religious minorities, ethnic minorities, national minorities in our country. Now that's going to give impetus to Americanization, right? That we have the way to deal with these foreigners is to transform them as quickly as possible into Americans. But at the same time, I think those institutional changes that we see in the military are real ones. They stay in place, they don't go away. And there are key individuals who become really committed to a sort of form of American pluralism. I want to note that there are limitations still on their vision of what religious pluralism looks like, but Newton Baker, Secretary of War Newton Baker, as a very important example, goes on to be one of the chairmen of the National Conference of Christians and Jews in that interwar period, and he advocates really strongly for and again, it's a complicated vision of Judeo-Christian America, but clearly something about his experience in the war led him to use his post-war free time to fight for this vision of a Judeo-Christian American society. And a number of other military chaplains, both Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, go on to do that interfaith work in the post-war period.
Wow. Maybe last question is from Michael Schatz. He indicates that one of our colleagues, a senior colleague, Deborah Dashmore, wrote one of the better titles in our field, GI Jews, about soldiering during World War II. You, in your last couple of slides, indicated certain parallels. What were some of the points of comparison and contrast between the Jewish experience in World War I and II on the soldiering side, of course?
On the soldiering side.
The soldiering and chaplain side. I mean, not as, of course, in the field victimhood.
So I think there are a lot of parallels and a lot of similar stories about the ways that military service forced young men from all kinds of different backgrounds, not necessarily to love each other, but to find ways to work together, to wrestle with and think about their identity in relation to groups of soldiers that they may not have encountered in other circumstances. And so Deborah Dashmore talks a lot about that experience of, living in the barracks and having to, get into a fight with the anti-Semitic soldier and making a friend, right? And I think there's a lot of comparison between those two experiences. Where I think it becomes different is that in World War II, the American cause in fighting against Nazism becomes tied to the idea that anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jews is not an American value. And I don't think that happens right away, and I don't think everybody is immediately on board with it. But the government, again, promotes through military propaganda, through its campaigns for war bonds, promote certain ideas. And as they fight against the ideals of Nazism, they sometimes implicitly, sometimes very overtly say anti-Semitism is not an American value. That was just not part of the rhetoric in World War I. And so I think World War II continues this process, builds upon that institutional foundation that's put in place in World War I, but makes the idea that all Americans must resist anti-Semitism part of a much larger social and cultural movement within the United States that we see really sort of come to fruition in the post-World War II period.
Really, really incredible. We've learned so much, and what the lessons here, the history, it's so much betokens Rabbi Landis's leadership and his legacy. And there was such erudition. Professor Cooperman, I can't thank you enough on behalf of everybody at Gratz College. Just really tremendous. And we'll bring out our colleague, Naomi Hausman, to end our program. Thank you again. So it was wonderful.
Thank you.
Agreed. That was truly wonderful. Thank you, Professor Cooperman. Thank you, President Elif, for this wonderful and insightful conversation, for this great presentation. We all learned a lot. I know I did. And thank you to all of you for all these, for participating and for all these wonderful questions, really excellent questions for our Q&A. Really made this program end in a very strong way. Just a note, as I mentioned earlier, we will send a recording to the recording of the presentation to all registrants. So check your email for that. Just a quick note, I want to make sure you, in case you missed it in the chat, I posted links to the next two Landis lectures. We have one on February 9th that will be presented by Raphael Medoff, the founding director of the David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies. And then March 8th, Derek Pensler, who is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University, will deliver the third and final presentation in the Landis Lecture Series for 2022. So if you missed the chats, the links in the chat, you can always go to our website, gratz.edu, for the information to register and to learn more about Gratz and all the programs that we offer. So I wanted to, we have a slide you can take a look at here. I just wanted to make sure, in case you missed the slideshow in the beginning of the program, that you understand a little bit about this lecture series and why it's so important to the family and to us. So just a few words here to share with you about that in tribute to Rabbi Admiral Aaron Landis. And just again, thank you to the family, the Landis family, for the gift that made this lecture series possible. We are very proud as an institution to help honor his memory. So with that said, good night to all, be well, and hope to see you all again soon.